Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm chatting with Scott Carpenter, a professor and author of books like French Like Moi, a Midwesterner in Paris. He's here to talk about that oh-so-French tradition of kissing one another hello, la bise. Hi, Scott. Welcome to Navigating the French. Can you give us a little bit of information about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Hi, Emily. I'm really glad to be here. Happy to talk to you about la bise and other things. I am a college prof who lives part-time in Paris. I'm also a writer, so I have a novel out that is set in France called Theory of Remainders. I have a collection of short stories, and then my most recent book is a kind of a memoir, an irreverent memoir about life in Paris called French Like Moi, a Midwesterner in Paris.
Amazing. I love me some irreverence. I'm sure our listeners will all love to hear about your experiences. And we're going to talk about some of your experiences. One of the sort of first cultural dances we have to do when we come over to France as Americans, and that is to manage la bise. So do you remember, first off, the first time that you kind of encountered la bise in France?
Oh, wow. That one is a tough question. I mean, I've been coming to France since I was a kid, and I don't think that, so first things were like school trips in elementary school. I went to school in London for a while, so people would hop across the channel. I don't think that people were planting big bees on me at that point, but, I suppose it was probably later as I was in my teenage years and was starting to make friends, and la bise just became this everyday thing, which, of course, most natives navigated without any difficulty, but it just remained a constant sort of puzzle to me. And it surprises me to learn that it's still a little puzzling sometimes for the French themselves.
Well, it can be puzzling in a lot of ways because there's so much variation. I think one thing that maybe surprises a lot of Americans, but I think there is still some lingering class discrepancy to this, is that when we imagine like the European, like, oh, moi, kisses, it's not, the French don't usually do air kisses, right? There is still some physical contact with la bise, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, we'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, about the differences with COVID when there's a little less contact. But
oh, yeah.
I think that most Americans get their introduction to la bise from watching like old movies where you have resistance fighters who are like about to traipse off toward their deaths, and as they head out on their mission, somebody plants, big kisses on their cheeks, or they're welcomed back, and Charles de Gaulle, pins a medal on them, that sort of thing. But it's this everyday kind of exchange, and it is curious how it is both, class and gender and proximity, levels of closeness in the relationship that govern the kind of greeting that you have. And so la bise, as you say, usually involves physical contact, but it actually doesn't usually involve like the lips touching another person. So it's kind of going cheek to cheek, and then little kissing sounds made. People kind of pucker up. But the lips usually, if they touch the cheek at all, they just sort of brush by it. So it looks like a kiss. It's kind of a kiss that just missed its target, just barely kind of thing.
Yeah, that's definitely my experience as well. You get like sort of contact of like cheek to cheek. I live in Paris, so it's 2 kisses, but that is another major confusion that I'm sure we're going to delve into. And the only other thing in terms of that physical contact that I've noticed, and this is obviously all pre-COVID, and we will delve into that, is that you, having come here as a child, might have experienced this. I've noticed that sometimes when children are doing la bise, or we say faire la bise, so doing la bise, making la bise with adults, often with children, you do have some lip contact, like they kiss your cheek and then you kiss the child's cheek. And I remember like that sort of evolving out of the like lip to cheek contact is kind of a sign that you're entering adolescence. But I don't know if that's true everywhere or if that's something you experienced.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I think that's exactly right. And what happens is that kids are not just making like contact with their lips; it's also like saliva contact. They tend to be kind of slobbery kinds of bees. And I've always enjoyed watching kids as they're kind of gathering around. It'll be first and second graders gathering around their schools before they're let in. And they're just kind of slobbering all over one another. And that happens with their relatives and, close family friends as well. And then there is this kind of gradual drying out of the bees as people get older. And then it turns into something that is somewhat more symbolic, I guess, where there is this kind of brushing against one another that is it's brief. There's very little contact, and then you move along. Of course, the other thing related to la bise. So the bise is this thing like between. So who does it to whom, right? And
right.
It's kids with parents, kids with adult family friends, family members. Getting up in the morning, sometimes, you sort of enter into the kitchen and people exchange bees. And then it turns into like people who are outside of the close friend network, and you'll have people who exchange the bees with certain colleagues, right? Colleagues that they also have a friendly relationship with, usually between it's women and women or men and women. So it's this heavily gendered thing. And then, of course, there is the bees between men, not a romantic bees, but for like close male friends who will also engage in this strange behavior.
Yeah, and that's super interesting, this sort of gender distinction discrepancy that we see, because generally speaking, when we're doing la bise, it's often done as like a way of greeting people or as a way of saying goodbye. And folks who've been listening to this podcast for a while will know that greetings are really important in France. You can't just walk into a party and sort of do like a wave, like, hey, everyone, and then like help yourself to some chips. You have to go around and say hello to everyone who's already there. And generally speaking, as you just said, I, as a woman, would find that like I'm going to pretty much give the bees to everybody. But if, there's a man coming into the party who doesn't necessarily know a lot of the other men, he's going to be shaking hands instead. And it's like a firm, like one pump handshake and move along. It's like a greeting.
Yeah, that's right.
But then you do, between, two brothers or two childhood friends who are both men, you do see men giving each other the bees. Is that something, because I'll admit, as someone where my default is always going to be la bise, my life is made a lot easier. Have you ever had to sort of grapple with like, oh, is this a guy that I'm going to do la bise with, or is this a handshake friend?
Yeah, this happens all of the time. I mean, this is sort of the major problem. It's a little bit like the tu and vous problem, right? The people that you're going to use the form tu with and the people that you use vous with. And there are plenty of people where it's like, okay, this person is clearly in that category and this person is clearly in that other category. But then there are these problematic in-between cases. And I sort of feel like I should be noting this down in the notes of my contact list, right? Of who I use this form of address with and who I use the other form with. And similarly with la bise, so especially with male friends, there is this kind of transition when you go from becoming just sort of friendly, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, we've been hanging around a lot, we're pretty close friends, and you start doing la bise, and then you have to like, who's going to make the first move? Who is it that initiates this and turns the friendship into like a much closer friendship? And are we all ready for it? But it's all these crazy things that happen in all sorts of relationships. You find yourself having to sort it out before you make the move.
Yeah, and make the move is another. I mean, that can get super awkward in the case of these regional variations that we have for la bise. So I live in Paris, which means that generally speaking, people are going to do two kisses, and you turn. It's the right cheek is in contact with the other person's right cheek, so you're going to the left. But I spend a lot of time in the South where they do three kisses, and they start with the left. And so if you haven't remembered that that's the kind of bees you're going to go for, you could end up colliding noses with someone and end up in a very awkward situation of like the wrong bees, or pulling back too early when someone else is going in for a third kiss. And I don't know if you've found, I think that most places in France are two or three, but I think there might even be some regions where there's like four kisses.
Yeah, there are actually plenty of regions. Of course, it's not even like completely regional, so you even find regional variation, and then it depends on what particular families have done or how it's sort of handled in this town or in this city. So it can become very complex. But you're right that typically in the South, especially the Southeast, it's three. In the Southwest, not so much. It's usually two. And then there are places in the just to the east and also a little bit to the west of Paris, sort of like certain parts of Normandy, where people will plant 4 Bs on the cheeks. You'll end up spending half of your day just like completing the greetings. And there are anecdotally, I've never encountered this, but a few places where it moves up to 5 Bs. So it gets quite problematic. And then, of course, there are differences in different Francophone countries. So people often assume that like French culture is French culture, and it goes along wherever French is spoken. But in Switzerland, it's typically 3 Bs in French-speaking Switzerland. And then you get into Africa, where suddenly the Bs isn't a thing. And so you have to be pretty attentive, and especially because people want to be culturally appropriate. And it's one of those things, it's sort of a giveaway, the way that, I don't know, I think that sometimes people living in a foreign country are a little bit like undercover agents, right? And you want to fit in as much as possible. And if your accent slips or you can't find a word, suddenly you're revealed as the outsider. And, so sometimes you go for the left cheek instead of the right cheek. And it's like, oh my goodness, somebody who doesn't quite belong. So all of these things have a lot to do with how we feel culturally about kind of our place and our role, whether we fit in or whether we feel like we're a little bit alien or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said about the accent rings really true to me as well. Like I've noticed, people who move up to Paris from the South and they have what I think is so charmingly, the French call it this singing accent, this accent
Right.
chantant. And often they'll lose it a little bit, but they won't completely lose it. And that's one thing along with this sort of like, oh, which side do you go to for La Bise? That sort of like remnants of your pre-Parisian existence that you might hold on to even after you move to the capital.
Yeah, that even ties into what you were saying earlier about class. So when people come to Paris, they often shed or attempt to shed their accent and some of their local behaviors. The reverse is rarely true. You rarely find Parisians going down south and starting to sing their French. So there is this idea that, France is such a centralized country. The center is so clearly Paris that is the sort of model for many things. And when people get there, that's what they try to emulate.
Yeah, you do even hear it in the language when people say they move to Paris. No matter from where they're coming, they say monter à Paris, to go up to Paris, even if
Right.
you're actually going south. There's not
Yeah.
that much. There's what most of the country is south of Paris, but still, if you came from east or west or north, you would still go up to Paris, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, which sort of suggests this elevation, right? It's not,
Yeah,
it's like ascending to the throne.
exactly. We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. Now, we started talking a little bit earlier, obviously, about how COVID has changed La Bise. Now, COVID's changed a lot of things, but I definitely noticed I was living in Paris during the first lockdowns, and as things started to deconfine, we actually had posters plastered all around the city that were reminding locals, à Paris, on se salue sans se toucher. In Paris, we greet one another without touching. I don't know if you noticed that. Did you notice sort of the French desire to touch one another, to greet one another when we weren't really supposed to be doing that?
Yeah, because it's done unconsciously, right? This is true of so many of our behaviors that we perform cultural acts without thinking about them. They're habitual. And greetings are certainly one of those. So the impulse, you can almost like feel the muscles tightening in, certain parts of your body as it's like, oh, I'm supposed to be moving in to give the Bise or to extend my hand for a shake, whatever the particular greeting is. And then, you start making that gesture and then you remember and you pull back. And everybody experienced this. You'd be walking down the street and, sort of anonymous Paris, and suddenly somebody you recognize, and you'd like make eye contact, and like over the brim of the mask, you would kind of recognize who it is. They would recognize you, moment of recognition, and both parties lean in ready to make that greeting, and then all of a sudden pulling back. I found this to be particularly, I don't know, sort of poignant in French life during COVID, right? That the Americans like to have a lot of space around them. They stand far apart when they're talking, the big handshake, so you got to be far apart because you're pumping really hard and things like that. Whereas in France, people stand together quite close to one another. This notion of social distancing is kind of built into America, but it's antithetical in France. And the same for this, the lack of contact, especially difficult in a French situation.
Yeah, and it turns out, so I was doing a bit of research in advance of this conversation, and I found out that this actually isn't the first time that La Bise has fallen out of fashion in France. So a lot of historians agree that there was La Bise as early as the Middle Ages, but then it saw a very rapid decline in popularity around the time of the Black Death, which seems to make sense to us now, but considering that people didn't really understand how diseases were communicated back then, seems kind of interesting. And then in the 19th century fell out of fashion again due to sort of like cultural prudishness. And we really see it kind of return to French society after the May 68 socialist revolution, which kind of made me start to think about it as, this desire to greet each other and to find some way to greet each other seems to be something like it's both this desire to be close to each other, as you were saying, and this desire to like find some way to recognize each other every time we say hello and goodbye. But there is that desire to make it physical, which strikes me as something Latin and maybe even French, or uniquely French.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly Latin, right? And it is interesting looking at the historical evolution of these things, the behaviors, but also the language that we use for it, right? So the word la bise is of more recent manufacture, and it has the same origin as baiser, so the kiss. So we often think of bise as being this kind of little peck on the cheek, and the baiser as being more kind of a lip-oriented kissing. But so one kind of springs from the other, and then there's this diminutive version of the bisou. So baiser, bise, bisou, and the bisou is sort of a more familiar term, but it also sometimes represents an even closer, sometimes more tender little kiss that is given. And then of course things happen to these words. So the verb baiser used to mean to kiss, which it still means in French, in modern French, when you have an object after it. So baiser la main de quelqu'un, to kiss the hand of someone. But the verb used just by itself, or else referring to just a person after it, suddenly takes on these vulgar connotations of sexual relations. So the bise ends up being this kind of much more neutral term that arises because there's nothing sexual or romantic implied in the notion of the bise, the way that the word baiser bears that kind of baggage.
Yeah, and when you bring up bisou, I find that very interesting as well, because I find a lot of foreigners get those two confused because they do sound alike, and bisou does kind of have this like cutesy connotation. Like often when you sign a message with like two X's, they're like des bisous, or like if you're signing off on the phone, you're like je te fais des bisous, like kiss kiss. Like it doesn't have to be romantic, but it is very distinct from this practice of la bise.
Yeah, that's right. So it's just interesting how these things are like etymologically identical. They should mean sort of the same thing, but of course it's a slightly different word and it adopts a slightly different use. And even the way that people spell bisou with an S, so B-I-S or B-I-Z, so it turns it into an even like more playful version when it's the B-I-Z version somehow. And then it's all complicated by the real verb in French for kissing, which is embrasser, which, of course, looks like to embrace. That's etymologically what it is. But embrasser quelqu'un, that's really, planting the big kiss on the lips. even more than Bise used to be. And it gets more complicated then when people like sign off on the phone, or they sign off on a letter or an email saying "Je t'embrasse," which sounds like that must be romantic then. But no. So embrasser by itself as a verb for kissing is the romantic version of kissing. But je t'embrasse is sort of like bise. It's expressing a close relationship, but not necessarily a romantic one.
So long story short, in France, we're cool with kissing our friends. And so it's no surprise that we have the reputation that we have.
Yeah, that's right.
But I see what you mean. Like there's this sort of evolution of all of these different terms, but really it's, you know, we are comfortable with physical contact with friends. We are comfortable with physical contact with people that we're even just sort of starting to get to know. You show up at a party and you get introduced to someone's new boyfriend, a new girlfriend, and you're going to go in for la bise. And so now what I'm seeing is that obviously with COVID, so before COVID, if you had a cold, for example, and you went to a party and someone went in for the bise, you would sort of like step back and with this very apologetic face be like, oh no, je te fais pas la bise. I won't bise you. I'm under the weather. And it's like this. We know that this is bad, but we also know that we have to apologize for not doing la bise. And now I've started to see, after that dance that you were referencing of like people who see each other in the street and they lean in and then they lean back and, oh no, what are we going to do? I've started to see some replacements coming. One of which I had already seen in the French countryside, which is if two people who work with their hands, and their hands are often messy, meet each other, instead of shaking hands, they'll often like touch elbows or touch forearms, like lean in and let each other touch the other person's forearm to forearm. So you're getting like forearm bise. And also like less often now, but at the very beginning of the pandemic, people still trying to figure out what they were doing. You'd see people kind of like touching feet, like foot to foot, like a foot bise. So even if we can't touch faces, we still want to touch each other. And this forearm thing feels like it's actually holding on. I haven't really bised anybody since the end of the pandemic, but I've done a lot of forearm bises in recent weeks. I don't know if you've noticed any other sort of changes or any other
Yeah. Well, first of all, Emily, I would say don't give up on the bise, right? I'm hoping it's not gone for good.
Excellent.
So I'm hoping that you'll be able to engage in that again sometime soon. That forearm thing that you were mentioning, boy, that goes way back. So you would see that out if you met a farmer if you're like picking up milk or something at a farm, and the farmer had been working, the farmer would extend his forearm for the shake so that the person with like the clean hand, so as not to sully his hand, would grasp the farmer's forearm. And now it's this kind of crossing of forearms or the elbow bump. And then the big one that I was noticing in Paris is the fist bump, which is referred to as le check, and even has this strange like verb now, checker, se checker, on se check, oui, on se check. And you give each other the fist bump, that little foot dance, that kind of like hop and touch of the toe or something. I've seen as well. And but I think the thing that I find most worrisome is that this has been going on for so long now. And these behaviors, and we were talking at the beginning about how ingrained these behaviors are, which means that, people, they feel natural to people because they've grown up with them. They've always done them. And these things are learned at an early age. And they're saying now that some children may have kind of missed the boat for this becoming a natural form of greeting. Because it has been so long since anybody has done la bise. So they were learning it, and then they have unlearned it successfully, which is what everybody wanted during the pandemic. They wanted us to unlearn these habits. And as you mentioned with events in the past, sometimes it takes a while before the practice resumes. So some of these kids may go 3 or 4 years before the bise is really fully back. And they may have lost it. It might just never be quite the same for them. And I find that somehow sad.
That is sad. It's like a whole part of culture and of coming into your own and learning how to navigate it, learning when to take your glasses off so that you don't glasses smoosh somebody else when you're bising. And, and all of those experiences of meeting that that guy or that girl who like goes in a bit too forcefully and you're like, oh no, my cheekbone has been plastered by somebody else's cheek. And it's definitely a cultural experience, and it's a really nice little greeting. I'm hoping it comes back and soon.
Yeah. Although there are also some people, and I guess, especially women, because as you say, women are, that's the default, right? Whether they're greeting women friends or male friends. So they're subjected to more bise than the rest of us. But some people have said, the bise was maybe not always that great to begin with. Maybe I'm not sorry that so-and-so whom I don't particularly like, is no longer invited to bear down on me and plant bise on me. So we'll have to see if things spring back fully, or if there's some modification in the behavior.
It'll be interesting to see that. Scott, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I have one last question for you before we sign off, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Oh, goodness gracious. My favorite word in French. I don't know, maybe éperdument.
Ooh.
So if you're like, you can just be wildly fascinated by something, or wildly in love with someone, or something like that. And so then an adverb like éperdument becomes useful.
I love that. And you've got lost baked right into there. So you got that sense of losing yourself in your emotions, or...
Exactly.
Love that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Folks who want to hear more from Scott should definitely check out French Like Moi, a Midwesterner in Paris. And I will have a link to that in our podcast episode description. Thank you so much for joining me, and à très bientôt.
Merci.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.